In this module, we're going to take a closer look at some of the specific tools that are involved in shaping representations. As we've discussed, as a number of scholars have helped us better understand how it is that the representations that we see in our media and communications platforms have such an important impact on the debates and discussions within our societies. Our critical scholars tell us that these representations have a pivotal role to play in helping us understand the world around us and the way we engage and interact with it. So in this module, we'll take a closer look at what some of those tools are that have a considerable impact on shaping the representations we get. One of the first tools recognized by media and communication scholars is what they call the tool of gatekeeping and providing visibility. And we'll talk in a minute about each of these. The second tool is the tool of agenda setting. And the third tool is the technique of framing. So let's take a look at each of these in turn. According to communication scholars, the tool of gatekeeping and visibility has a considerable impact in terms of shaping the representations we get. For these scholars, they argue that media and communications ultimately act as gatekeepers, providing visibility to certain issues and individuals over others. Because, of course, on any given day, there are millions and millions of events and issues, a plethora of them playing out all over the world. But ultimately, there is only a small handful of these that will make it in to the various media platforms that we will engage with. So, for those who study the area of gatekeeping and visibility, their interest is in trying to find out why it is that certain issues, certain events, are always likely to get greater coverage, greater visibility than others. And they argue that this is really where we see this gatekeeping role of the media as considerably prominent. And they argue also that the selection of information, so the way in which our media and communications outlets select certain information over others, is not necessarily always in keeping with objective reality. In other words, an issue or an event may not necessarily be covered because it is objectively more important. There can often be many other reasons that inform why certain issues are covered rather than others. And of course, if we think about things like the excessive coverage of celebrity or sport, or the way in which elite politics is prioritized in our news, I think that gives us some indication of the fact that the selection of information is based on a range of priorities and not necessarily just how important, objectively speaking, an issue is. Of course, in the context of visibility, there's also this idea of civic visibility and cultural recognition. And these debates are less necessarily about the visibility of particular issues or events, but rather their interest is on the media visibility of particular groups. So, for example, whether or not minority groups are given sufficient visibility and representation in our media or not, or whether they are largely rendered invisible from our communication spheres. So for these scholars, their interest is more in the kind of cultural recognition that that kind of visibility brings. So then gatekeeping and visibility clearly is one of the key mechanisms through which our representations are shaped in quite particular ways. The second area that scholars focus on in the context of representation is a focus on what they call the agenda setting power of media. Now, this particular theory or this particular approach to understanding the power of media is interested more in looking at how it is that the media, through its everyday and its repetitive coverage of certain issues and certain events, can place them much more highly on the public agenda than other issues. And so here they're really interested in how it is that the media sets those agendas. As Stanley Cohen famously said, the media may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but they are stunningly successful in telling readers what to think about. So the point Cohen is really making there is that through their repetitive and continuous coverage and attention given to particular issues, the media have a powerful role in shaping our understanding of what we should be thinking about, of what is important, what are the issues we should be talking about. And this is really the agenda setting power that they are referring to. And so, in that context, the continuous selection of certain information and issues signals that they are probably more relevant, signals their greater relevance and importance for publics, and in that sense determines what they give more public attention to. The third key tool that shapes representation that we're going to talk about finally is the tool of framing. Now, of course, this is a term that is used a great deal in common parlance as well, how an issue is framed, how a particular way of thinking is framed. And in this context, when we're talking about media and media and communications, we are referring to a similar idea in terms of how the view of a particular issue can be shaped. So let's see what exactly we mean by frames. So frames, Entman would argue, offer us a way to understand how the information contained within any given text is mediated so as to privilege a particular reading of that text. So, in other words, how is the information or the content in any particular output? How is that content shaped in a particular way, structured in a particular way, so as to privilege a particular reading of it, to prompt only a particular way of thinking about it? And Entman argues that these frames that are routinely used in the way in which our information is shaped, he argues they perform four functions. Sometimes those frames can be for problem definition. So the way in which an issue is structured or framed defines the problem in a particular way. And because the problem is defined in a particular way, there is a particular analysis of what we see the cause of it to be. And finally, as a result of this particular cause, there is then moral judgment that, okay, if this is the cause, then this is the issue and this is what we should do. And then finally, there is a particular form of remedy promotion that comes out of that, a particular way of, in fact, trying to solve the issue. And so those frames then result in a particular set of outcomes that perhaps may or may not have happened had issues been framed in a different way. And as a result, they have quite a powerful role to play in shaping our understanding of key issues in our societies. These framing techniques then, of course, shape audience interpretations. They may introduce or raise the prominence of certain ideas or link one issue to another, encouraging audiences to think and feel and decide, therefore, in a very particular way. In the context of these tools, of course, we can also talk about the more specific techniques, the techniques of language that in fact build our content in a particular way. So for scholars of representation, one of the key meaning-making tools they look at is the tool of discourse. Now, discourse, of course, encompasses potentially any form of statement. So it includes speech, text, imagery, so any aspect of knowledge and information is a type of discourse. And discourse analysis as a method, or discourse analytic approaches, are systematically about studying the various structures and strategies of text or talk. So the kind of grammar used, the kind of language used, the way in which different phrases are associated with one another, the way in which different issues are interlinked with one another, and how all this connects to the larger social, cultural, and political context. This is what is meant by discourse analysis. So here's an example. This is from a study that was done a long time ago in the Guardian newspaper in 1991, but it's a very simple illustration of what a discourse analysis looks like. In this particular chart, we have a summary done, a study done, looking at the kind of language that was used during the first Gulf War in 1991. And the interest here is in trying to understand how us and them mentality was created between the different sides in the war. And so it looks at the language used by British newspapers during that week. And it specifically compares the language that was used when they would talk about British soldiers and troops versus the language they would use when they would talk about the Iraqi military and government. And if you have a look at this table, you can clearly see how the very different use of terms and the very different use of terminologies can, in fact, have a considerable impact on the way in which we would understand the issue and the way in which we would view the different sides. Quite clearly, we would be much more inclined to feel sympathetic to one side over another on the basis of the kinds of language that is used. So we can see then that there are a number of quite complex and nuanced ways in which the representations we see in media and communications every day are shaped. And as our critical and cultural scholars have told us, the way in which these representations are shaped can have a very profound impact on how we understand the issues and events that take place in the world around us. And in fact, how we understand our place in this world and who we feel are the people who are most like us. So, very much in terms of creating and defining those boundaries of us and them, media representations have a tremendous impact in trying to help us understand those.